Hey guys, and welcome back to Weather Wednesday. It's great to have you back for another video. Today we're going to talk about lakes, rivers, and bays. So I get a lot of questions about if the weather principles that I'm teaching apply to inland lakes, rivers, or other small bodies of water. And the answer is yes. These principles still apply anytime you're near a coast or an area where there's land meeting water. The only difference is everything happens on a much smaller scale. So we're gonna go through a couple of examples of what I mean and different sizes of bodies of water and what you can expect. One thing I always tell people is that a lot of this depends on your racetrack and the time over which your race is taking place, right? So distance racers in keel boats racing over multiple days may be able to take advantage of a very large lake that's say 20, 30, 50 miles across, whereas if you're sailing in a dinghy on a 2-mile course, if the other side of the lake is 30 miles away, it's not going to matter to you to take advantage of either side of that lake. So really the size of the race course matters, and how long you're going to be racing also comes into play. So some of the factors that we're going to want to think about are the size of the body of water, any topography around the land, any frictional shifts, convergence and divergence that you might get on the coast due to the frictional shift over land, water and air temperature, which will help us determine the stability. So just remember, each small body of water is completely different. You're gonna have to evaluate which of these factors are gonna play a part in your local area. First, we have large lakes and bays. These are maybe 10 plus nautical miles in their widest direction, or 16 or so kilometers in diameter. Basically, when we have a really large lake like this, we're going to consider them essentially their own coastline. So most likely the lake is so large that if you're day racing, you're only going to be on one side of the coastline. If you are doing a distance race and crossing a long distance to get to the other side, you're going to evaluate each coast independently as to whether or not there's convergence, divergence, maybe more pressure, or any other shifts. Large lakes and bays examples are all of the Great Lakes, Lake Pontchartrain, maybe eastern Long Island Sound where it opens up quite a bit, anything that is on a large scale where you might only be racing on one side of the coast. For smaller lakes and bays, we're talking on the order of 5 to 10 nautical miles, or about 8 to 16 kilometers in diameter. Examples of smaller size lakes and bays would be Tampa Bay, Biscayne Bay, Buzzards Bay, Charleston, some parts of Annapolis, western Long Island Sound where it's a bit narrower, the lower Hudson Bay in New York, and San Francisco Bay. So most of the smaller areas that we sail are in this smaller category. And in this category, these coastal features are generally really important in the race course strategy. So what we have are 2 different coastlines, or sometimes 3 or 4 if it's a totally enclosed lake or bay. And those coastal effects may be happening on 2 different sides of the race course. So the race course could spread far enough to get into both sides of the coast. So in these examples, we have coastal features existing on both sides of the lake. Sometimes, depending on the size of the bay or lake, there might be a middle zone, okay? And so this middle zone is where there's really not much of an effect from the coastline. The smaller the lake is, the smaller that middle zone gets to be, or maybe not at all. If it's a bay where you have 2 coasts very close together, there may not be much of a middle transition zone from one to the other. And so these coastal features may collide or even alternate on a very small scale. So it's important to do an analysis of your own, of how far apart the coasts are and how far apart the coastal effects may come out into the water. Typically, we see these coastal effects most obvious within about a half a mile to a mile off the coast, but they can reach maybe up to 5, 6, 7 nautical miles away from the shore. So it depends. If you have a smaller lake, you're probably going to see on the smaller side of things, maybe a half mile or mile. If we're talking about a much larger coastline like the Great Lakes, that could extend maybe up to 5, 6 miles away from the shoreline of the effects of convergence and divergence. So the last type of enclosed or inland waterway we might have is a very small lake or maybe even a river. So this would be something that's on the order of maybe a mile or even less at its widest point. That would be about 1 to 2 kilometers. So if the sailing area is less than about a mile, most likely you're going to have the gradient conditions prevailing. So because it's such a small area, you probably will just notice whatever the gradient wind is going to be flowing across the water. And if you don't have much gradient, you may get the features from either side oscillating or coming back and forth across the lake. It's also possible you could get a little bit of a lake breeze, but it becomes very difficult on something that's about less than a mile to generate its own thermal lake breeze. So it's a little bit less likely on a smaller lake. So basically, the smaller the body of water is, the more these different coastal features will collide and cause it to be shiftier. There'll be less room in the middle where conditions are not dependent on coastal features. If you are sailing on a river or maybe the intercoastal waterway or something that's very long and skinny, we also tend to have the wind will either flow one direction or the other parallel to that long skinny body of water. And that's just because the wind likes to take the path of least resistance, and most of the time it will pick one of those directions to flow, especially if there's topography on either side. If it's very flat and there's no topography, you may not get as much funneling in the parallel direction of that river. It may just be more of whatever the gradient wind is. All right, guys, thanks so much for joining in. We'd love to hear your experiences or your thoughts on lakes, river sailing, and sailing on small bodies of water. Put your comments down below and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks, guys. We'll see you next time.